Uh, Thank you, Tori, for the introduction. Thank you, Ra, and to everyone putting on the event and everyone who is here tonight. My name is Allison Kreiner Brown, and she and her pronouns, and I am delighted to do this introduction on behalf of DOEE, who was a partner in the racial equity cohort for the last 3 years. So I want to briefly introduce racial equity just to start to frame the conversation. What really are we talking about? So racial equity is about fairness, not sameness. It acknowledges and seeks to repair the harm that has been caused by decades and truthfully centuries of policies and practices that deliberately and systematically disadvantaged Black people and predominantly Black communities and other people of color and communities of color. Throughout history, racial inequities have been driven by interests related to power, land, and wealth. Racial equity refers to two things. Number one, the result that we will see when race statistically no longer can be used to predict the likelihood of negative outcomes for Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color in our communities. For example, we see things like asthma rates and unemployment rates, graduation rates. And it is the deliberate process, strategy, and approach that we take to get there. Government plays a central role in achieving racial equity because government was among the institutions that created and perpetuated the inequities of the past and present. Likewise, government is in a position to protect residents and communities, to repair harm, and advance opportunities where they have been unequally distributed. The legacies of systemic and structural racism impacted people's lives in ways that continue to reverberate today. We see that in statistics like in the wealth gaps that you see between Black and white families, particularly here in DC. However, I'm gonna share an example that pulls from the past that also, I hope you will see some connections that continue to resonate forward. So I'm gonna read in just a moment a passage from Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, which has become a really seminal text for people who are doing racial equity work and trying to understand the systems aspect. And one of the things that Rothstein talks about is the impact of redlining on communities, on Black communities in particular. And yes, DC was a city that had redlining. It's very interesting to look at those maps and compare them to today. And one of the impacts of redlining was that Black homeowners could not get mortgages that were backed by the federal government. So they could not get mortgages, the conventional mortgages from the banks, which means they had to use a tool called contract sales, in which the real estate company that sold them the house is also who they would pay their monthly mortgage to, but they didn't gain equity in those homes because it was not an insured loan. And in The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein shares an example. This actually comes from Chicago, but is completely applicable to DC for how do we understand how the impacts of certain policies went beyond just the immediate policy, but also rippled forth and continue to ripple it today. So it states, because Black contract buyers knew how easily they could lose their homes, they struggled to make their inflated monthly payments. Husbands and wives both worked double shifts. They neglected basic maintenance. They subdivided their apartments, crammed in extra tenants, and when possible, charged their tenants hefty rents. White people observed that their new Black neighbors overcrowded and neglected their properties. Overcrowded neighborhoods meant overcrowded schools. In Chicago, this also happened in DC, officials responded by double shifting the students, half attended in the morning, half attended in the afternoon. Children were deprived of a full day of schooling and left to fend for themselves in the afternoon hours. These conditions helped fuel the rise of gangs, which in turn terrorized shop owners and residents alike. In the end, whites fled these neighborhoods, but also because of the influx, not only because of the influx of Black families, but also because they were upset about overcrowding, decaying schools, and crime. The Black contract buyers did not have the option of leaving a declining neighborhood before their properties were paid for in full. If they did, they would lose everything they'd invested in that property to date. Whites could leave, Blacks had to stay. So with that, and particularly helping to make the connection between wealth and funds as a need for addressing racial equity, I'm going to pass it to Quabila Huddleston.
Thank you, Allison. I have not read that book yet, and I need to, because clearly there's a lot of information that I need to learn. So again, my name is Quabila Huddleston. I use she, her pronouns. I work at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, and it is with that hat that I bring you my comments today. Black DC residents, especially Native Washingtonians, are suffering from the same anti-Blackness within government systems, policies, and laws that claim the lives, homes, health, and jobs of their communities years and centuries ago. Between 2000 and 2010, gentrification forced 20,000 Black residents out of the city. Today, the wealth of Black households is 81 times less than that of white households. The legacy and an ongoing occurrence of institutional racism makes it necessary for all levels of DC government, from the executive to the council, to center racial equity, not only in how they govern and legislate, but also in how they allocate the city's financial resources. DCFPI is especially interested in how policymakers leverage the budget to advance an anti-racist and equitable future. Why does that matter? It matters because the DC budget is a moral document. It's more than just the dollars and cents, billions of dollars, right, that the mayor and DC council invest every year. The DC budget sets the city's priorities and, importantly, identifies who and what city leaders value. And I think back to the debate that happened last budget season over whether or not to add additional money to build more schools in Ward 3, where white families are honestly self-segregating and sending their children to schools there over the needs of children and families attending schools east of the river that are crumbling and have been long awaiting, modernization. I also think about Chairman Mendelson's decision to exclude the budget from the racial equity impact assessments that the REACH Act would have had. DCFPI strongly feels that that was a huge misstep. And I can't help but think about if a similar debate were to arise this budget season and the budget were subjected to a RIA, how differently the outcomes would be for those families and children in Ward 7 and 8 waiting for their school buildings to be modernized and safe. And so in conclusion, we know that the consequences of inequitable systems and investments in the DC budget are clear. DC is a prosperous city, but it is leaving Black and Brown residents and low-income residents behind. The REACH Act provides a seminal opportunity for the DC government to repair the harm that has been done and presents an opportunity to mitigate any new harms. But still, as I mentioned, we know that additional steps, such as requiring the budget to be subjected to a racial equity impact assessment, are needed to truly advance equity and provide justice to DC's most marginalized communities. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Alice, and thank you, Quabila, for that. I never get tired of being informed of that because we have so much to do. I'm going to introduce our next three presenters, our next three guests in a block, and then I'm going to let them tell you about themselves. First person is Ward 5 Council Member and Native son, Kenyan McDuffie. That will be followed by Dr. Brian McClure, who's the director of the core office, the Council Office of Racial Equity. And then Brian will be followed by Dr. Amber Hewitt, the sister office, DC, and she's the DC Chief Equity Officer. So if Council Member Homeboy McDuffie is on the line as he's joined us, I'm going to. Yeah, council members, I'm so glad you made it. So why don't you update us, start off with telling us about how the REACH Act came about. Because if we talk about the REACH Act in the city, mostly everybody's heard of the REACH Act, but when you try to ask for more detail, or no one quite, not as many understand what the REACH Act is supposed to do and what it will achieve. So why don't you tell us how the REACH Act came about and update us on where we are right now with the REACH Act and any other wealth closing policies or bills that are in the pikes right now. Councilmember Kenyan McDuffie.
Thank you, Ra. I appreciate it. I mean, I've been here from the start, so I've been listening. I appreciate being here. My name is Kenyan McDuffie. As mentioned, I'm council member representing Ward 5 on the Council of the District of Columbia. I also serve as the council's chair pro tem and the chair of the Committee on Business and Economic Development. I've been on the council since May of 2012, but as Rob mentioned, I've been a native son, a native Washingtonian my entire life. Been right here in this house where I'm seated is where I grew up. I'd like to thank Parisa and all of Empire DC, as well as Ra and Tori for inviting me to participate in tonight's event to talk about the REACH Act. I also want to say that I'm pleased to be on the same event as Kabila and Allison, as well as my good friend Brian McClure, who now leads the Council's Office on Racial Equity, and Dr. Amber Hewitt, who I know is working hard to achieve some really positive change as the Executive Chief Equity Officer. So back in 2017, I really started working more intentionally on achieving racial equity in DC. I had a number of conversations with people like George Jones of Bread for the City and other advocates, David Bowers, and just a host of people who had an interest in this issue and have been doing research and having conversations about racial equity and what was happening around the country. In 2019, after establishing a working group on racial equity, where I had a number of people from the philanthropic community, nonprofit community, government, and business come together, get trained on racial equity. We had council members and all their staff who were interested be trained on racial equity. It really culminated in January 2019 when I introduced the REACH Act with really huge support, broad support across the District of Columbia to ensure every aspect of our government's work is done through the lens of racial equity so that residents' race no longer predicts their ability to succeed in our city. In 2020, the council unanimously passed this landmark legislation in December of 2020, and implementation started just this year in January with the launch of the Council's Office of Racial Equity, and subsequently Mayor Bowser hiring the district's first Chief Equity Officer, who you all will hear from this evening. To date, this bill is, I think, and hopefully some will agree, is one of the most significant legislative steps our government has taken to advance racial equity in our city. The final implementation piece of the REACH Act will be establishing the Racial Equity Commission to help us identify some of the best ways to bring about the structural change that was mentioned by some of our earlier speakers, and I'm sure we'll hear more from about that tonight. So I look forward to implementing that provision with my colleagues at the council, Chairman Mendelson and others, and finish laying the groundwork for our district government that approaches every issue before us through the lens of racial equity. Already, I think that the REACH Act is really influencing the legislative process by forcing the council to adopt a more intentional approach toward advancing racial equity. We've seen the Corps' office issue racial equity impact assessments that have informed and helped to shape our discussions on the comp plan, for example. I think it was a really important discussion that was really informed by the REAR. The flavored tobacco prohibition bill that just recently came up this week, and much more legislation to come, I think, is being informed by the Council's Office on Racial Equity. As you all may know, and probably have seen during the council debate, Corps' REAs found that the mayor submitted a comprehensive plan that exacerbated racial equity, whereas the council's version made some impactful and significant changes to the comp plan that elevated racial equity as a policy priority, and the state decisions must use a racial equity lens. I rejected the mayor's requested upflums around Carmel School, working with Parisa and the residents throughout Ivy City, because I believe that getting the community a recreation center shouldn't be conditioned on getting a preferred developer the opportunity to build more housing in the neighborhood. I understand the significant need to build more affordable housing in the District of Columbia, but I also know that it's important that we address the immediate needs of communities across the District of Columbia that need amenities, services, and benefits that they've been clamoring for in Ivy City's case for decades. And so I want to briefly shift gears if I could, Rod, and discuss some of the things I'm focused on now to further advance racial equity in the district as a priority. In May, I introduced the Child Wealth Building Act. Some of you may have heard, call it a baby bonds proposal that will codify economic opportunity as a birthright for many Washingtonians. If enacted, the Child Wealth Building Act will provide a government-sponsored trust fund for babies born to the district into a household whose income does not exceed 500% of the federal poverty level, which currently translates into approximately $130,000 or so for a family of four. Enrollment would be automatic, and each eligible child will receive an initial deposit of approximately $1,000, followed by annual deposits of up to $2,000, depending on household income. Upon turning 18, the child could withdraw the funds for specific purposes, including education, either higher education through college or vocational education or training for certifications and things like that, business ownership, investments in business, property ownership, down payments on home ownership, which we know. I heard, I think Allison mentioned The Color of Law earlier, which I think is a very important book. You should definitely read it when you get a chance, Kabila. But home ownership is one of the most significant ways of building wealth in our country. If passed, the Child Wealth Building Act would be one of the most significant laws, I think, to pass the council in recent history, and specifically designed to help close the district's stark racial wealth gap, which drives the deep inequities that we see in our city. I introduced this legislation because I think the cost of maintaining the status quo, I mean, people have talked about the cost and how much we would be spending for something like this. Frankly, I think the cost of maintaining the status quo is simply too high because, you all know the statistics, you've heard them before. We're in a city where a Black family's median net worth is approximately $3,500, which is 81 times less than the median net worth of white families in our city, where Black residents experience an unemployment rate of approximately 12%, 5 times higher than that of white unemployment, and where fewer than 14% of district businesses are Black owned, whereas about 71% are white owned. So, we can't address systemic racial inequities in our city without intentionally investing in families and individuals of lower incomes and communities that have been disconnected, where we've seen disinvestments, primarily in communities of color that have historically been prevented from accessing wealth building opportunities. Connecticut recently passed their own baby bonds program. I've been following that one pretty closely, which, while not as, I think, far-reaching as the bill that I've introduced, it's a significant step forward. And I think it demonstrates this type of program is viable at the state level. If we have the political will here in the District of Columbia, we can advance it as well. As the budget cycle moves forward, as I close, our team is going to continue sharing updates on the process and our legislative priorities. I want to encourage all of you to follow us on social media at CM_McDuffie for the latest information and to share with us your feedback about that baby bonds bill and any other things you'd like us to focus on. I do appreciate everybody who's testified with respect to some of the things that I've worked on over the years: baby bonds, REACH Act, NEAR Act, comprehensive juvenile justice reform, affordable housing. I want to keep on building here in our city, because only by building those types of systems that are fundamentally transformational and are intentional and they're designed to account for the implicit bias and systemic inequities will every district resident truly have the same opportunities to prosper in our society. So I'm gonna stop right there, Ra. And I know you have a couple other folks who
yeah, Councilmember, but we do have a couple of questions, of course, and they came from the community and from the cohort. I'm not going to hit you up with too many because I know how busy that you are and your team over there, and we really appreciate that. Really appreciate that here in Ward 5. But one of the questions that came in is the baby bond. Is that a pilot program or a full-blown program?
No, it's a full blown program. I think some of you all may know that I sent a pretty broad letter with budget priorities to the mayor back in February, where I made a request for approximately $400 million worth of new investments. One of them was for baby bonds, but there was also one for a pilot guaranteed basic income program. And so that specific program was for a pilot. And we're still hopeful that we can work to do that. We've had some great conversations with some of the advocates who have an interest in that, and we're working on that. But the baby bonds initiative would be permanent, though.
Thank you, Council Member. Another question. Baby bonds will take 18 years for kids born today. And I think I saw that's kids born in fiscal year 2022. What should we do to make sure that the families are still here 18 years from now?
I think that's how much time do we have? There are lots of things we need to do. I think broadly speaking, we need to be bold in how we think about creating healthier, safer communities. We can't continue doing business as usual when it comes to public policy and expect different results, which is why a number of things that I've done over the years have been, I think, transformational in their approach. Some of them are longer term things, but some of them have been more immediate. If you think about the NEAR Act, it introduced a public health based approach to crime prevention and intervention so that we wouldn't simply depend on the law enforcement aspect of criminal justice. I've done things like the disposition of district-owned land where it requires 20% affordable housing when we're building multifamily housing of 10 units or more, and it requires 30% when it's closer to mass transit. And so, I've been really sort of approaching this in a way that we need to be bold, which is why I'm really pushing hard for baby bonds. And although it would take some time to mature, I think doing things like universal basic income, guaranteed basic income pilots, which are more immediate, I think will help to close the racial wealth gap and really account for the centuries of systemic racism and just the institutional barriers that make it difficult for people of color, Black people in particular, in our city to achieve prosperity. And so I think we've got to be bold, I think is a short way to put it. I think when you think about how communities are affected today, there's still parents in neighborhoods across the city, especially in wards 5, 7, and 8, who don't even let their kids play in their yards because they fear the child might be shot. So we can't just continue building housing and think that all the rising tide is going to lift all ships, because it doesn't. We have plenty of data that backs that up. We can't continue just simply hiring police officers, recycling summer crime programs, and think that we're going to fundamentally make communities healthy and safer. We're not. We've got to really, I think, be bolder and make those types of investments that are going to fundamentally transform the odds for people who haven't had the same opportunities in our city.
Thank you, Council Member. I know that you have a full schedule this evening. I've been in contact with your staff. I hope that you can hang around a little bit and hear some of the lived experience. But I do want to close out right now just with saying, when you say bold, yes, it reminds me of some of those great politicians from DC, the 1960s and early 70s in DC. Thank you. Yeah. And so now we're going to turn it over to Dr. Brian McClure. Give us an intro. Your intro.
Hello, everyone, and thanks again for having me. So I'll do my best to keep my opening remarks brief because I'm really here to hear from you and to learn from you all. So before I jump into it, thank you to Empower DC, to our friends at the DC Alliance, to DC FPI, Allison, Quabila, and always it's good to see and be on the panel with someone who I've come to consider a mentor, someone that I've learned a lot from, in Councilmember McDuffie. And without his leadership, we would not be here. And also excited to also have my counterpart over on the executive, Dr. Hewitt, here as well. I figured I'd just share a really brief story. I remember about 3 years ago now, I guess, sitting up on the top of my stairs, writing what would come to be the REACH Act and struggling with it, wrestling with it. And there was this one thing that kept tripping me up. And it was this weird thing I had never heard of called a RIA. And so I told the council member, look, we just need to introduce it. You know, I'm not sure what's going on. And he pushed back. And he said, well, what are other jurisdictions doing? Is there something we could model it off of? I just said, I'm not sure. It doesn't make sense to me right now. He was really reluctant, but I was like, look, I can't figure this thing out. And so we ended up having a hearing, and thanks to the work of the folks at Empower DC, the Alliance, there were well over 100 people that attended that hearing. You know, there are a lot of people who talked about how it would be possible to go about leading this work and making sure that this work was successful. So, you know, one, I want to be reflective tonight, and that, you know, it was not inevitable that we would be here in this moment. It took a lot of work. It took us hearing from you. It took us learning from you and thinking and being in deep study about how to do it. And so tonight, you know, I'm just humbled to be able to see that we have an office that is reviewing policy, that's working with members so that we can be intentional about how we improve outcomes for Black people, for other residents of color. That's something that has not systematically happened in the district. And so I want us to be able to sit with that as we have deep conversations tonight. And so I'm going to keep my remarks short. I hope you all have a lot of questions. But again, thank you all for having me, and looking forward to diving into this in a little bit more detail.
Thank you, Brother Brian. So now we're going to move on and let Dr. Amber Hewitt give us her intro. Dr. Hewitt?
Yes, thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all tonight. I definitely want to thank Empower DC, the Racial Equity Cohort, all of the organizers, the DC Initiative, and also a special shout out to Allison Kreiner Brown, who's one of the first colleagues on the executive side that I met, and they're doing great work over in the Department of Energy and Environment. I also want to thank Mayor Bowser for appointing me to this historic position. And like my other panelists said, I'm excited to be on the virtual stage with them, with Dr. McClure, as well as Councilmember McDuffie, for being a champion for racial equity. So first, just want to locate myself. So I'm Amber Hewitt, she, her, hers. I identify as a Black, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied woman. So I come in with my own lived experiences of racial inequities, but I also recognize some of my privileges. So I want to start with just telling you a little bit more about me personally. I don't always get to talk about that, and a little bit more about my professional journey. And then I'll share just a little bit about some of the guiding principles of the Executive Office of Racial Equity, and why I'm really excited to hear more about the lived experiences of those most impacted by racial inequity. So when folks ask me to sort of tell me about yourself, I always start with, I'm a daughter of the Deep South. I'm the daughter of parents who came of age during the Civil Rights Movement. So I grew up as a little Black girl in Shreveport, Louisiana, and was raised by a father, amongst many other things, was a community organizer, and was one of my first teachers about what it means to be Black, what it means to be a Black woman in this country. So I grew up on books like Anthony Browder's Now Valley Civilization, the ISIS Papers, the FBI Files of Malcolm X. And I was raised by a great Black woman who was a trailblazer in her own right. In the 1980s in Louisiana, she started and founded a nursing department at LSU Medical Center. So when I think about who I am and what drives me and my values, I think about my parents. I also think about the varied experiences of my professional background. So I started out as a researcher and an educator, but what's significant about that and how it connects to this role is that my research was based in schools, based in communities. And I designed programs and curricula specifically for Black boys, designed to facilitate their critical consciousness. So having conversations about what does it mean to be you? What does it mean to be a young Black man where you are? How do you see yourself? How do other people see you? How not to internalize the negative images and stereotypes about who you are, and getting a sense of their power. So not empowering them, helping them get in touch with their own power and how they can use that to have an impact on their community. So that is how I started my career in psychology. I'm a psychologist by training, and my work really emphasized a move towards decolonizing the field and not looking just at the individual, but those systemic and social cultural factors that impact health and well-being. So I'm excited to be in this position as Brian and I work together across government to eliminate racial inequities for residents of the district, particularly Black residents. And there are 5 guiding principles that are guiding my work. Before I close, I just want to share those with you. It's around acknowledging the historical and structural factors that drive racial inequities, centering the voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, targeting solutions to those most affected by racial inequities, leading and centering race, but also examining issues through an intersectional lens, so looking at the intersection of racism, sexism, ableism, et cetera. And that this work, we have to be in it for the long haul, and that we have to have a commitment to long-term sustained investment in racial equity. So I'll close with, reflecting on the holiday that's approaching and the act that passed through Congress. So as we approach Juneteenth, I think it teaches us that when we talk about racial equity, we must also talk about liberation and liberatory practices to dismantle the root causes of racial inequities. And I think it's also important for us to remember, as the Sankofa principle tells us, because as we look back, it helps us to understand how to move forward. And I think part of that looking back is listening and learning from the lived experiences of those most impacted by racial inequities. And that's what I'm most looking forward to this evening. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Tori.
So a lot has been said. Thank you guys for introducing yourselves. And really quickly, I just want to show gratitude to the Corps office for those RIAs that were done on the comp plan, as well as the flavored tobacco. That's very important, and both Councilmember McDuffie and Dr. McClure mentioned how effective those were to show how racial inequities were exacerbated. We're going to move into the next section and/or phase of our program, and I'm going to introduce some of our cohort members, the Empower DC Racial Equity Cohort. Again, this was a cohort that was created about 3 years ago, probably late 2018. And the 3 members that you're going to hear from today for those lived experiences are 3 women who live and work and have been in DC. One from our first member, Lark Cato, who is a Ward 5 member resident. She and Shayna Potter and Linda Brown were those advocates who put boots to the ground to go out and ask residents early on in the conceptual phases of the REACH Act about racial equity, what they knew about racial equity, what was racial equity, how did they envision a DC that was racially equitable, and if they've ever experienced any racial inequities. And so these were questions that were asked by the DC Racial Equity Cohort members, and we asked all over in every ward in DC to really see if residents understood what racial equity was, so that when the REACH Act was passed, they would know how big of a stake it was for them. And so we're going to start with Lark. Cato, who is going to talk about her lived experience. After Lark, Shayna Potter will give her lived experience, and last in the lived experience will be Linda Brown. Now, if you are in the chat, please feel free. Any audience members can put their lived experience in the chat, and we will pull one or two of those lived experiences as it concerns racial equity and intersections that are associated with racial equity. We will pull those, and we will read yours as well. So I'll start with Lark, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Hi. Being a mother of an autistic teenager and a daughter of a paranoid schizophrenic has made me an activist specifically for mothers like me, struggling with depression, anxiety, along with being unemployed and just downright unskilled because of my DC public school education to my UDC degree. Feeling housing insecurity my entire adult life and having your entire childhood trash along with your mother's while you have no say in her well-being or where she stays. Clearly, I have experienced a lot of trauma, and my teenagers have too. I will be blunt. Teachers shouldn't have to be social workers. Trauma-informed care shouldn't be a thing. If we truly want the education gap and crime to be a non-issue, we need to create laws that intentionally prevent trauma. The way I see it, the entire makeup of American society and its history was made to intentionally hurt Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. We should first start with how we educate our children. My autistic child should have never have to cry at night thinking he is dumb because he can't understand Shakespeare and or poetry. How we teach and what we teach needs to change. Secondly, my adult child should have access to higher education that won't put him in debt. The expenses of life shouldn't deter him from acquiring his dreams. Life shouldn't be this difficult. How can poor people thrive if they are always in survival mode? Once a teen that ran away from home 2 months shy of my 18th birthday, I later found out my mother basically raised me untreated my entire life. I loved my mother the only way I knew how, and she loved me the best of her abilities. Sadly, because there is a dictatorship in governing vulnerable individuals as ward of the state, we were separated physically and never got what we truly wanted, each other. If we truly want to end homelessness, we need to have an honest conversation with how we treat people with different mental abilities. We also need to have another honest conversation about how mental breakdowns come from a society that is too hard to deal with. Living in America is hard, and society in particularly isn't at all forgiving, understanding, and truly helpful. Creating nonprofits to fill the voids that the government isn't providing, and having private companies get tax breaks when they donate to nonprofits creates a corrupt narrative of never holding accountability of what our government should be providing in the first place. I also want to express that not only did the government take away my mother and her beloved items from me, the government is denying me an inheritance and even threatening to take my youngest child. How much trauma do you think I can handle? How much abuse do you think poor people should continue to accept?
Thank you, Lark. Shayna, if you are in the room, you can go ahead with your lived experience.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Shayna Potter, Empower DC advocate, activist, and entrepreneur. I'm a proud BIPOC native Washingtonian. I've aspired to be an entrepreneur since I was a child. However, there were always college preparatory support programs, but never any entrepreneur programs available. Had there been, I would have been on it. Our only option was to obtain a bachelor's degree in business management or administration in college. About 20 years ago, that was the move that everyone was making due to high interest in entrepreneurship. I graduated from high school in 1997 and proceeded to search for entrepreneurial opportunities and resources in my area and beyond. I always came up dry. In 2014, I took my first official entrepreneur class and was still clueless on how to start. I took a few more, won business plan contests, earned various certifications. Finally, on November 4th, 2019, my mom's birthday, I enrolled in a resident-owned business incubator and 6 months later, earned a business and home occupancy license. I finally got it. Outside of caring for my mom, who passed away on the same morning of my business pitch competition on May 7th, 2020, it took me 20 years for the proper resources to be available for me to learn the ropes and gain startup funding. The young lady who runs Roby is around my age and also says that it took her 20 years to get it right while caring for her 4 sons. Lack of resources for low-income residents motivated her to start Can I Live, Inc., a local nonprofit that hosts the Roby program. This was my motivation to create a social enterprise that develops programs for aspiring entrepreneurs, artists, athletes, and entertainers. The other facet to my business is providing research development, journalism, editing, and event planning for racial equity, environmental democracy, cannabis policy reform, and social justice. After leaving for college on my 18th birthday, August 20th, 1997, I returned home to care for my mom after about 3 months. I also ended up caring for my grandfather with Alzheimer's for a few years prior to his passing. During the housing bubble of the early 2000s, our family home was lost and my mom and I were subject to homelessness. Yes, living from place to place is homelessness, not having a home of your own. I placed myself on the housing voucher list in 2003, but I was not legally disabled at the time. My mom placed us both on the list as a senior applicant in 2006. We weren't called until 2012 for a home. Needless to say, all of these issues strongly contributed to our mental stability, physical health, my mother's heavy drinking and cigarette intake, my anxiety, stress, and PTSD, and just our overall wellness as a family. We could not embrace spiritual nor physical health or wealth in this situation. My disability benefits came through in 2011, but we were still living under a slumlord in poor inhabitable conditions. Being blessed with these funds and not having anywhere to invest in your home and comfort just makes no sense. My mom died from complications influenced by excessive alcohol and cigarette abuse. And I honestly believe that if a better housing system was in place 20 years ago, she would have indulged in a happier, healthier quality of life. I would have had my youth, health, happiness, and over 20 years of freedom instead of being burdened with the depression of a parent who was a victim of a system that failed them. I'm basically disabled due to the stress of homelessness and adult instability. Coming from a stable childhood and teen life of employment and life planning, it was a shock to enter that world with absolutely no resources to turn to. This system is not for the protection nor the betterment of the people. There are several elements to achieving racial equity. Let's start with income. Level the playing field with reparations first. In order to maintain the new level of living, self-sufficiency by way of entrepreneurship and employment is required. Education, training, and placement programs must be developed to support the Reparations Stimulus Program, or RSP. Curriculums will cover entrepreneurship, job training, financial management, and wealth building, for example. This new Reparations Stimulus Program, or RSP, will also include a housing segment, possibly offering a 15% AMI through our Resident Ownership Program Enrollment, or ROPE. Why deal with the stress of rent when you can own? There's a significant imbalance in the current housing situation, including gentrification, displacement, a high AMI, inhabitable living conditions, and unfair relocation options. This can be changed by opening up more market rate housing as public housing options and lowering the current AMI. Adequate housing leads to healthy environments for the community. Each person and animal on this planet is entitled to habitable, healthy, happy living. It should be a priority, not a luxury option. It is our priority as the brilliant warriors that we are to assure that this happens. This means that we have a responsibility to the environment, its maintenance, our community, its operations, and our individual livelihood on a whole. It's funny how those who care the most have the least. If our basic daily habitable living needs are met, then maybe we, the people, can focus on maintaining the environment, plant life and wildlife that can't fend for themselves. It is our duty to them, to us, and first and foremost to God. If we don't care, then no one will. The needs of the environment do not deserve to be neglected, and neither do ours. But plants and animals can't stand up to those who hold the power to change, but we can, so let's call to action. Thank you.
Thank you, Shayna, for giving us your lived experience. We're gonna go to Linda, but after Linda, we're going to add Kevin Cunningham, who is also a member of the Racial Equity Cohort and was one of the members who worked heavily on racial equity surveys going throughout the district, asking residents about their views and situations with racial equity. Linda, thank you. You can go ahead now.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm Linda Brown, and I live in Ward 6. I am a native Washingtonian. I have a daughter who was born disabled. I have been dealing with the inequities in the healthcare system for over 28 years. The pandemic made it easier to spot those inequities. For example, my daughter is totally dependent and is nonverbal. Early in April, she became sick and was COVID positive. When the first responders came to our apartment, I told them where her doctors were located and how it would be easier if she was there at the hospital where her doctors were located. To minimize her anxiety levels. However, they were adamant about routing us to United Medical. At the ER, United Medical. My daughter was anxious and nervous. They had a hard time drawing blood. And so we were there for hours. And so they sent us back home while we waited for the results of COVID test. We would sit home at 1 a.m. in the morning. And the next few days, while we waited for the test, her symptoms persist. And I finally took her to the ER at Washington Hospital Center. And they found out that she had a GI tract infection and immediately admitted her at Washington Hospital Center. So when they admitted her, the doctor called 2 days later to give us the results of her COVID test. And by that time, we were already admitted on the floor at Washington Hospital Center. And then after that, they cleaned up, they immediately took her out of the room that we were in and put her in the ICU. And I had to leave the hospital immediately. The care that Black women receive is different. No one listens to us. I can start with my pregnancy with my daughter. It was assumed that I was on drugs and my child was a premature because of it. It was assumed that I was not married, but I had a husband who was not even included in those conversations with the doctor and nurses. Today, my daughter and I have public insurance, but when she was born, she had private insurance. There are just a few of the stereotypes that are formed and persist due to the inequities. I could say that it was private versus public insurance, but it isn't. I've experienced microaggressions and biases in both situations. And the common denominator is my race and gender. I had to advocate from day one for my respect and equity in the healthcare system as I support my child. And now, as a Black woman who is truly wanted to be here, because she's here. This has been my life experience, and it affects everything from my income, my housing, and my general way of life. So just by this experience, it has brought to light so many things that needs to be accomplished. So thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Kevin, if you can go ahead and start with your lived experience that you wanted to add.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Tori, so much. Good evening to everyone. I'm a member of the Cohort and Equity training that we did since, as Tori said, 2018. This subject is near and dear to me, and especially with Parissa. Me and her go a long way back in the early beginnings, and she used to visit me when I lived in Ivy City, trying to get Cromell reopened as a community center. I'm so happy. I brought a tear to my eye the other day that they finally funded it, and they're going to do something that neighborhood, my home neighborhood, sorely needed. And I'm so happy about that. And Parissa worked very hard, and me and her used to talk and go around and have little meetings and doing things, reaching out to community to get that stuff done. But we're talking about the act today, and I had the most enjoyable time in 2019, that spring and summer, as my cohort members, Rod, Tori, Shayna, and others, Linda, all of you, we went to every aspect of the city getting the information from the people. And we wanted to know, what did they know about equity? And we got a lot of information, a lot of good talks. A lot of people knew about equity, but some people didn't. So we had to educate some to get some good answers for the surveys we were doing, because we were everywhere. And one part that really touched me is when we was up on George Avenue getting survey answers. There was a young lady. She was, I'll say 23 or 24 years old. And we got engaged when I asked her about the survey, and she was giving me her answers to the questions. And she was so knowledgeable. And for a person so young, and knew so much about equity, and gave me some real definitive answers about things that need to change. And I was so enamored by her because she was so young and she knew so much. And it almost made me cry because she was so young and knew so much and wanted to participate and help so much. And I say, there's hope. There's hope in our communities. And hopefully with some of these changes and with the rules, with the REACH Act, that we can get things done, because we definitely need things done to make it more affordable, more equitable for every Black and brown person in the city. And I told Tori I wasn't going to stay on here long because I do like to talk. I'm a former telemarketer, so I like to talk, but I will not. I just want to add my piece. because last several months I haven't participated as much as I could. I had some health issues and some family tragedy. And I just wanted to say my piece because this is very important to me. And I want to thank you guys for allowing me to speak. And you can continue on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kevin. We really appreciate that. So we've heard some of the lived experiences. I don't know if I don't see any others listed in the chat that we can pull from. I do see a hand up from Alfred. I think the last name is Swallies. If you have something to say, I think Parisa can unmute you and you can, yeah, there you are.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening, Alfred.
Yeah, Councilman McDuffie, Dr. McClure, and the new equity director. I think that's what her title is. I'm gonna say something here because I want to make sure I'm not a government employee. And I am a business owner, and I'm a lifelong Washingtonian. Grew up in Ward 4. I still live in Ward 4. And I grew up in the Petworth area. President Biden said something that I think is very, very good to this conversation the other day. I think it was like 2 weeks ago, where he said that the United States is the only country that was built on an idea, the idea that all men are created equal and are endowed with certain equitable rights, freedom, justice, and pursuit of happiness. And the government is there to protect those rights for us. Now, what has happened for Black folks is the government, they can't take our rights away because, again, the rights come from God, but they have put obstacles and they have violated our rights over the years. And in DC, we find that one of the ways that they have done that is through business. As Councilmember McDuffie said, in the city, there's 43% now Black, and one time was 85%. If only 78% of the businesses are not owned by Black, that's crazy. So who's hiring Black people? The statistics shows that Black people, Black businesses hire more people of color, Blacks, than any other race. So if we only own 12% of the businesses, that's not enough businesses to create the type of economy that we need in our community. We're the only race in this country who has a welfare poverty economy. We either want or ask from the government everything we need, or their outsources, their nonprofit organizations, their training programs, their everything. We're the only ones that don't look toward business to create our economy. And I understand that if you're a government worker and you're a council member, that's your boundary. You have to stay within your lane. Your lane is government creating policies that government can do. But government does not create business. Government is there to make sure that business is able to succeed, and nobody else can stop them from succeeding because of their color. That's all they're supposed to do. They are not supposed to be creating the economy for us, okay? Now, how they've done this gentrification thing, Councilman McDuffie, is this. They have used Black people and white people's dollars and give it to the developers and develop housing that we can't even afford. They use our own money against us. They use our own money against us. Now, you might say, well, why is nobody hollering? Because we are hollering, but we might be hollering about the wrong thing. We're hollering because the government is using our money against us, and we're the victims. White's not being victimized. They're using white people's money, but they're not the victims, so they're not gonna be part of that crowd who's gonna start yelling. I'm sorry that Councilmember McDuffie didn't mention the disparity study that we're trying to do. That's so important in this city because it's never really been done a full-fledged disparity study done on the way the government spends its dollars in contracts. Because again, if they...
Brother Alfred, thank you. We thank you so much, man. What, you know...
Oh, don't cut me off.
We just mindful of the time. We have a full agenda, that's all. We have to keep moving, be mindful of everybody's time tonight, but contact us so we can continue this conversation and get it on another platform.
See, this is why I don't like coming on these things, man. You know, somebody start telling the truth and you want to cut them off. You want to talk about how wonderful it is. I can tell you how life is so wonderful. That's what you want to hear?
I don't think that's what we've been hearing, but we do appreciate you adding to the conversation. Your point is a great one. And I am glad you raised the disparity study that's taking place. We just have some time to have discussion with Brian McClure and Amber Hewitt. So we want to make sure we do that. And this does not have to be the last conversation. You know, we can make this a beginning. So.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, thank you everyone for sharing your lived experience. You know, I want to say out to our community tonight that the brothers and sisters that you heard from, you can find them anywhere from the office of the council of the district, testifying at hearings, organizing out with the people. They're working on affordable housing issues, displacement, energy equity, the district budget, Carmel School, Ivy City, education and health equity. And, you know, in other words, you know, they're looking at this intersectionally. So I thank you again, and thank you for sharing your story. And I put the question out there to all of us tonight. What would it look like if we all told our stories as if we were free? Tori, let's start a discussion with Brian and Amber, and I'm going to let you have the first question.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ra. That's a very good question that you posed to give us a chance to think about. The first, and I want to echo, you know, Mr. Alfred, that, you know, we do want to hear the truth. And so we hope that we hear from you again and that you join Empower DC as we do work across the district. But the first question is, as we listen to lived experiences from some of the cohort members, and you saw some of the intersectionalities of and some of the other areas that overlap, so homelessness, how affordable housing, entrepreneurship, education, mental health, all those things, how will the REACH Act address these lived experiences?
So I don't have a hard and fast date. I think September-ish is a reasonable.
I'll be happy to go first, and thank you for that question. So, you know, one of the byproducts of the REACH Act was the establishment of the Council Office of Racial Equity, or CORE for short. And one of the things that we truly believe is it is our responsibility to give power back to the people. And we do this in several ways. One, by creating clear entry points where the people can actually access the room. You know, we're not talking about giving people access to the room. We're talking about completely recreating what that room looks like. And it's a room where the people have access to making decisions. And so we first begin by looking inwardly and looking at, you know, what is the makeup and composition of our staff? Does it reflect those that look like the people of Washington, D.C., of those people that have been in the city before forces such as gentrification? We wanted to sit down and think about, do people have access to our content? When council is putting out, you know, whether it's hearing notices, creating hearings, how can CORE make sure that all of these processes are accessible? And so even anytime you see a document coming out of CORE, we're going to make sure that it is something that's simple to digest, something that's easy to read and easy to understand, because we want everyone to be able to pick it up and be able to have a glimpse of what's going on and what our position is on a specific issue, even to the point to where how we write numbers. You know, we want to be mindful that there may be people who have different levels of ability. And so different text systems may pick up, you know, a dash in between a number. And so we've thought through all these different things to make sure all our documents are accessible. And lastly, I'll end by just talking about doing things new, as far as making sure that people we believe should be compensated for their time. So one of the things CORE does when we hold focus groups, moving into the future, we want to explore how can we make sure if people are having to take time away from work, that they are being compensated within the realm of what the law allows. But also making sure that whenever we're having reviews of our RIAs, that we have embedded community feedback. And so even when we talk about the methodology of the and you all may hear my kids upstairs screaming. So if you hear something, it's just the kids in the background. But nonetheless, I'll and they may be telling me I need to wrap it up. But, you know, I was just going to say, whenever you see our RIA, that RIA has been informed by sitting down and talking with folks at Empower DC, getting that feedback. You know, although it you know, may be painful, they may tell us like, look, y'all done a terrible job. Like, you know, and so going back, taking that feedback, taking that criticism, making sure we are accounting for the lived experiences so that it comes out naturally in the work that we're doing. So that's what it means to us to address the lived experiences in our work.
Well, thank you, Brian. So I'm going to put this question out there. It comes from the community. This question is both for Amber and for Brian, Dr. McClure and Dr. Hewitt here. I'm going to frame it a little bit for you, okay? The way that I had this discussion in the community, and I think it will help us get there, right? So it started with, let's make this conversation real and let's make it concrete. Over the past year, thousands of people got behind on their rent, and most are Black and brown. The process has been slow to help people in need. How do we think about, how do you think about when you end the rent moratorium with regards to racial equity in mind? And what do we need to know before we end the rent moratorium? I hope that came across clear.
Yes.
Amber, if you're okay with it, Dr. Hewitt.
Yes, I would actually like to address the first question and then segue into this one, if that's okay, around how do we address it. Okay. But I first wanted to thank Lark, Shanna, Linda, Kevin, and Alfred. And I think when we hear those lived experiences, we hear that these issues are connected. So even in your current question about the eviction moratorium and housing, we don't live in silos. All of these issues are collected, and part of my role on the executive side is fostering interagency collaboration. I just want to echo Brian around one of the ways we address the lived experiences is by centering meaningful, true community and stakeholder engagement as we design policies and as we design tools. And the question was about how will the REACH Act do that, but I just want to dovetail on what Allison said. So racial equity work in the executive didn't start with me or the REACH Act. So I know Allison mentioned the work of the Department of Energy and Environment. So part of my role is strategic alignment, coordinating existing racial equity initiatives. Is there work that needs to be done? Absolutely. There is great work that needs to be done, starting with more meaningful community engagement. So I just wanted to address that. But before I toss it over to Brian to answer the question around housing, I just wanted to flag the Stay DC program that's currently being implemented and highlighting that resource. But when we think about housing and the eviction moratorium, It's definitely a serious issue. And my office has only been in existence for a couple of months, so we're still standing up infrastructure. And how Lark has done in the chat, I'm really here to hear about some of those innovative solutions from you all.
And thanks, Dr. Hewitt. The only thing I would add to that is, you know, here at CORE, we take what we call a groundwater approach, which is a systems approach to solving longstanding problems. And Ms. Potter, Shana earlier, you know, she described what needs to happen better than I ever could, right? And so when we talk about the groundwater approach, what Ms. Shana talked about earlier is addressing the underlying issues. The problem is not just the fact that people don't have the whatever dollar amount is to pay the rent. It's that there may be mental health crises that have been experienced. There may be loss, a tragic loss that have come about. There may be issues with access to transportation, health equity issues. And so until we are able to really understand how all of these things are interconnected, you know, we have to be very cautious in whatever steps we take. And I'll just, you know, wanted to list out a few stats. You know, about 58% of folks within the Latinx community in the district are rent burdened. About 54% of Black folks are, compared to less than 20% of white residents in the district. But still, we also know that 86% of persons that are experiencing homelessness in the district are Black. And, you know, but when we also look at what it takes for people to go through the state DC application, on average, it's taken residents about 3 to 4 hours to complete these applications. And so these are real problems that need to be addressed. And until we are able to look at them comprehensively, you know, even if, you know, someone receives money to pay their rent or their back rent, well, what happens when now they have to go pay groceries or pay their utilities? And so we're gonna keep perpetuating the status quo and these racial inequities until we are able to address some of these larger systems.
Thank you, Dr. Corey. Yeah, so that you guys touched on this, the next question that I'm gonna ask. You touched on it a little bit, but I'll still ask it, and I'll add another question along with it. So racial equity, we know, is a process and an outcome. So how can we meaningfully engage impacted communities? Because you guys both mentioned that it's going to take that stakeholder, not only stakeholder engagement, the stakeholder being the community, but how can we meaningfully engage that community and, you know, help them to set these racial equity goals?
I can take a stab at that. And I just first wanted to highlight something I put in the chat. So on the executive side, we're standing up a racial equity advisory board. And I think someone mentioned the importance of having representation across the district and across all wards. So I just wanted to highlight in the chat, there's an application to apply for that board. So I invite all of you to apply. I invite all of you to hold me accountable in this position. And we definitely want to hear from you. And when we talk about racial equity being a process, that process is meaningfully engaging community. And you hit on priority setting. So one of the first projects coming out of my office, and I've also consulted with Dr. McClure on this, is a broader measurement and data strategy. What are our district-wide racial equity goals? Of course, that's going to build on the mayor's priorities and existing racial equity priorities in the agencies, but what do folks in this virtual room, what do our community members say about some of the pressing needs? And then from that, what are the metrics, what are the data points that we can identify to track our progress over time? So this is a collective effort. So when I talk about, setting our racial equity priorities, our racial equity strategic plan, to me, that means meaningfully engaging community to not only inform, but help to develop some of those initiatives. And I mentioned I'm only a couple months into this role, but my first hire is a community engagement specialist. So we'll be coming up with a meaningful community engagement strategic plan that centers racial equity. And I think what that looks like is meeting folks, where they are, being creative around sort of how we receive information. Brian mentioned making sure that his reports are, accessible to the people. That's part of the infrastructure that we plan to stand up on the executive side and as a way, formal and informal ways for folks to share not only the lived experiences of racial inequities, but the solution. So tapping into the wisdom of folks who are most impacted to help us come up with some of those policy solutions.
Great, thank you for that. There's a question from the chat that I just want to pull out because you mentioned the advisory board. And so there's a question from Dewan Mason. Can either of you explain the difference between applying for the advisory board or the commission?
I'll toss that to Brian since he helped write the legislation.
Yeah, so just as a reminder, the Racial Equity Achieves Results legislation has several components. One, it created the Council Office of Racial Equity. It also created Dr. Hewitt's office, but then it also created two separate commissions. One, I'm not even going to try to remember the title for the one for the council. It's really long, but it's something to the effect of the Commission on Social Justice, Economic Justice, and Racial Equity. And then there's a Racial Equity Advisory Board. Both of these commissions, the commission, what the intent is to provide guidance to have that community input and accountability check for council. The Racial Equity Advisory Board was intended to serve as the advisory council for the executive side. One of the things that is important is that we also wrote into the REACH Act that these all of these different offices and commission have to coordinate and collaborate together. And so while they are distinct entities, they were crafted in such a way that they could meet the needs of both offices. Dr. Hewitt, did I miss anything?
No.
And I would just add to the question that I was asked, if any government processes do not center the voices of those that have, by design, been the most marginalized, then we are constantly going to end up with an outcome that is racially inequitable. And so one of the things that we did when we first launched back in January, and many of you have heard me mention this before, was we designed it's actually called Designing Racially Equitable Legislation Toolkit. One of the first questions that we asked in it was, who is at the table, who is not, and why not? And so one of the things that we do is we constantly work with staff to make sure that they are asking these questions, to make sure that we are centering the voices of those that need to be heard.
Yeah, thank you both. Actually, you both covered in your previous answers the next question that I had. So I'm going to go with another question that came out of the community. How can DC residents, and especially impacted folks, support your work and help make it more impactful? And I'm going to throw in there, Brian, can the council of the district ignore the recommendations of your office and your office as well, Amber?
Dr. Hewitt, would you like me to take this one first? Or?
Sure.
Sure. So thanks for that question. And absolutely no, it can't be ignored. And so by council rules, what you may be referring to is that a bill can still proceed even if it receives a score that says that a measure will exacerbate racial inequity or even has the potential to exacerbate racial inequity or would maintain the status quo of racial inequity. In the same way that a fiscal impact statement that may cost $1 billion could still proceed, it would just be subject to appropriations, which means folks would just need to find money for it. What we always tell people is that our job is to do the assessment, to make sure that it is a document that will be memorialized, and members, staff will be able to have the information and understand what the intent and outcome will be of a measure. But the next step is where this work will only be successful if it's done in conjunction with the public. You all have done an amazing job holding myself, my office, and holding the entire council accountable. And so when CORE puts out a RIA, and the conclusion is that a measure, will have a negative outcome, then that's where you should be calling up your members. You should be, getting on social media, letting residents know that, look, this is CORE's report. This is what it says. This is how it's going to impact you. Because getting that information, having people to sit with it is something that is critical to this entire work being successful. So I can't remember what your second question was, but I'll just give a quick example before throwing it over to Dr. Hewitt. We saw this take place with the comprehensive plan. The bill that came down to us had a lot of problems, and it was 1,500 pages full of problems. And so we literally went through, we conducted a preliminary analysis that was much more in depth than what you all saw in that final report. That critiqued a lot of the language that was being used. It did not center the lived experiences of residents. The solutions were outdated and not relevant with what was happening in the city. And those are things that we spoke to in depth. Now, the council listened, and they, even several members withheld their initial vote because of what came out in the report, and said that they wanted to spend more time sitting with the report, talking with the community to better understand. That resulted in a flurry of amendments that came to improve the document. And as we know, the bill pushed forward. But if it had not been for that report, we would have ended up with a document that would have exacerbated racial inequities.
Yes. Dr. Hewitt, you want to jump in?
Yes, and I'll jump to the original question around how DC residents can support the work. So I just want to just flag again a couple of things that I already mentioned around the advisory board, and we're this office we're still in the planning phase, and part of that planning will be reaching out to community in innovative ways and driving towards practice change. So how can we look at our existing ways, our existing practices around engaging community beyond just input to, centering not only the voices, but some of the solutions. So I'll sort of, I look forward to coming back and, further expounding on that question. And I invite all of you to sort of share with me and my future team as we stand it up to make sure that we are sharing power with communities, especially those most impacted.
Thank you. Dr. Hewitt, while I have you here, I'm going to give you the next question. How do you see the city will be different in 5 years? Let's say 5 years and 10 years due to the REACH Act. So let's start with 5 years. And Brian, you're going to have the same question, Dr. McClure.
Well, Brian and I share the same mission, the eliminate. Oh.
That was me. How do you see the city will be different? I interrupted, pardon.
Okay. No, I was just going to say, Brian and I share the same mission around the elimination of racial inequity. So that's what we're striving for. So when I look 5 years from now, I see us closing some of the racial equity gaps. And racial equity, I know it's become sort of this buzzword, but we're really talking about our targeted strategies to close gaps in outcomes. So when I think about 5 years from now, I envision a more racially equitable city. I envision us closing some of the existing racial equity gaps, and some of the community indicators and metrics of that work, I hope, is that community members see themselves in this work, and that we have made progress on engaging and meaningfully engaging community. So those are two of the top things that I would want to see 5 years from now.
And I would just say, I'm reminded of the words, I believe James Baldwin spoke, who said, how much time do you want me to wait for your progress? And so I'm tired of waiting. And I don't think the folks that we heard from earlier, many of the people that are on this call, many of the residents that are experiencing these racial inequities that we're talking about can afford to wait. So I'm here to, I'm not afraid to say this, to shake things up. I'm tired of the status quo. Those of you who have heard me talk before have heard me talk about my family, my lived experiences. So my great-great-great-grandfather just showed up in 1814. We don't know where he came from. We just know that he arrived on a slave ship in South Carolina and was shortly sold to Georgia. And then his child, my great-great-grandfather, in 1860 goes south to Mississippi to be reconnected with other family that had been sold. My grandfather was a sharecropper who did not receive compensation for the work that he performed, that my uncles performed. So how long do we have to wait? So I don't want to think about what this is going to look like in 5 years. I totally agree with Dr. Hewitt. We have a lot of work to do. We could talk about our strategic plans and our visions, but the thing I want to emphasize to you all is that racial equity in DC can't wait.
Brian, Amber, Dr. McClure, Dr. Hewitt, thank you for sharing parts of your story tonight. Tori, would you like to say anything to Dr. Hewitt and Dr. McClure before I introduce our next presenter?
Yeah, thank you guys. This was a great conversation. In your introductions, in other questions, you answered other questions that the community had. I just want to again tell you that that from Empower DC and Parisa made note of this in the comments too, that the RIA done on the comp plan was extremely helpful. And so we hope to see more of that so that we can point out those racial inequities. And we look forward to possibly having some of our Empower DC members apply to that advisory board, Dr. Hewitt, so that you can hear from the community and the advocates throughout the district. So we really appreciate you. And we, again, thank all of the cohort members who gave their lived experiences.
Thank you. Our next guest, thank you. Brian, did you have something else to say?
Oh, I was just saying thank you all for having me, and it's been an honor. And also, I typically always do this, but wanted to shout out my staff who worked extremely hard on the comp plan and the other RIAs. We asked a lot of them. We launched in January and have been moving full steam ahead ever since. So, this office would not be what it is without the work of our team. And also my wife is on here, Tracy McClure. So, shout out to her too.
Right. Right on, man, right on. Yeah, and also I have to, if I haven't done it yet, I have to say shout out to Councilman McDuffie's team, his staff. I work very closely with them, and this shout out to the council member staff. I hope some of them are still on tonight, hanging on there. And our next guest is Dr. Chioma Aru. And pardon me if I did not get your last name correct, so I stand to be corrected. And Dr. Aru is from DC Initiative on Racial Equity, and she's going to give us some updates, advise us on some next steps, and sound that call to action that I spoke of at the beginning of the program. Dr. Chioma, are you there?
Yeah, it's just Chioma tonight. So thank you, everybody. This has been so amazing. And, I see the heart and the minds at work here, just taking it all in. You know, so again, I'm Chioma Rue. I'm here with the DC Initiative on Racial Equity, which Empower DC is very much a part of, and it's part of our coordinating committee, along with other great, you know, organizations that are connected to many, to the people on the ground, the real Washingtonians, right? So just a couple of things, couple of reflections. DC Initiative, for those of you who may not know who we are here to monitor, right, to encourage, and to continue to hold the city accountable for the implementation, the proper implementation of the REACH Act. And I'm so glad that Dr. McClure has, you know, accredited the efforts that has gotten the REACH Act passed coming from the community, and we are constantly encouraged by his work in that office, as well as we're very proud and happy to have Dr. Hewitt represent in the mayor's office. We are going to be meeting as in the DC Initiative, which includes pretty much everyone here, meeting monthly with Dr. Hewitt to help shape the agenda as she's moving forward. As she's mentioned, to staff in her office, and that we hope to be front and center there. We will be in touch with Parisa, with Empower DC, and our other partners to encourage participation in those monthly meetings. Also want to make sure that you have a way to access us as we continue to ramp up our next chapters. So I'm dropping in the chat our email address. So in the next few months, we're just really taking time to do one-on-one small groups, engage with organizations on the ground to learn like what are your policy and programmatic you know, initiatives and priorities at this time, so we can integrate and synthesize that and move forward to the next steps for, as we said, to monitor and encourage and ensure the proper implementation of the REACH Act. So again, our email address is in the chat, and we'll soon be very much reaching out to many of you who are on this call right now. Thank you so much.
Time, do you mind if I kind of poll the room real quick? And I wonder if folks attending tonight would be interested in, I know we touched on many issues, but only just surface, you know, just a little bit. Would you be interested in trying to work with, especially Dr. Hewitt, if possible, to host some more in-depth conversations that really focus on those solutions that you all had been bringing up in, you know, in many, of course, intersectional areas, but areas of housing, income, you know, perhaps we could have a series of conversations. But I'd like to know, you know, and the other thing that Dr. Hewitt said that I'm really excited about is having an in-depth discussion about what does it mean to do real, meaningful, racially equitable engagement, right, with the community, and not just input, but power in decision making. So that would be one key thing that I would love for us to have a follow-up conversation about, so that we could share those views with Dr. Hewitt and hopefully work collaboratively with her, but perhaps similarly on some of the other issues that were discussed. We'd love to do that, you know, with the leadership of the members who took the lead tonight, and with the DC Initiative and our organizational partners, if that's something that resonates with folks on the call.
I see a lot of yeses in the chat, and so there are people that are definitely interested in that, Parisa. So.
Tori, do you have any closing words as we get ready to say good night to our guest?
Yeah, I just implore everyone to check out the Empower DC website, specifically the racial equity and all of the projects and campaigns that we are working on. Yeah, reach out and see how you can be of assistance and how we can continue this conversation going forward. And we really appreciate you coming out. We had a full house, and so this is very hopeful. And, you know, like Dr. Hewitt stated, it's about either Dr. Hewitt or Dr. McClure stated, it's about accountability, holding each other accountable to ensure that, you know, we live in a society where everyone has equity. So thank you guys for coming out tonight, and I'll just hand it over to Rod to close out.
Yeah, and you know, I want to close out by saying this is our city. This is our city, whether you've been here for 3 to 5 generations or 3 to 5 weeks. This is our city. So remember, tell your story as if you were free. Thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you for sharing your time with us. We really appreciate it.
Can I interrupt, please?
Yes.
Really quick. I put some stuff in the chat that's been ignored. I believe.
Is that who's that? Imani?
Yes, this is Imani.
I'm sorry, Imani. Go ahead.
I wanted to reach out to McDuffie, but I think he left the call. So if anyone from his staff or Amber Hewitt can contact me, I put my email in the chat. Wendy C has reached out to McDuffie's office and sent our testimony for the baby bonds hearing on May 25th. And the deadline to respond to that on their side is tomorrow. So we're still waiting to hear back from that. We have a lot of questions and concerns about the guaranteed income program and are requesting a meeting. So
thank you, Imani. I do apologize for us not catching that. And I think, is it Max Fox?
I think Malcolm Fox is still in the room. And
still
so
on the line from McDuffie's office, Imani. So I hope, Malcolm, did you get that? Give us a shout out in the chat. If you did, you can connect with Imani. We can connect you.
Oh, Malcolm wants us to repeat that that information, but he's in the chat, Imani. So I don't know if you can see his name. Thanks.
I see his name. I sent my email again, or if Malcolm can post his email, so I have his as well, and I can reiterate that on the email. I don't want to take too much of your time.
Thank you, Imani. It's always good to see you. Shout out to 1DC.
Thank you.
I just want to shout out also Ra and Tori for doing a fantastic job running tonight's event. Thank you. They did a lot of work to prepare. Thank you, everybody, for being part of it. And as we go out, we're going to listen to the full song that was featured in that video earlier, which actually a local DC artist worked with the cohort and was inspired by the cohort to create this song. So thank you again, everybody. And we hope to see you at the next.
Thank you, Rod. Thank you, everyone.
Right on. Keep building.
Apologies, I somehow accidentally closed it out, so I'm going to have to find it again. Here we go.
Empower DC, sanctuary. Racial equity in DC is the topic. Though DC natives are soul chanting people over profit. The chant is powerful, but will the chant stop it? My apartment is filled with lead while I have been led to believe that while I apply for the same position, that the decision was not based on my dreads, my skin tone, my high cheekbones, my unattended soul seat. Racial inequity speaks to me deeply, cause that's the seed they planted in me when they tease me and dangle in my face new businesses, new condos that's coming pronto, but still so much homelessness though. Now we rise with change in our minds. We organize and build power through our minds. We mentally envision first and physically we'll see that having racial equity will empower DC. It's never been a peaceful revolution. Knowing thyself is the solution. Water me down says confusion. No more statistics, facts are proven. Everything though comes to an conclusion. Ending the process of misusing. Ending believing in illusion. For a minute, let's change with the truism. Let's rebel for a minute. Hey, prevail for a minute. Be bold for a minute. Let the truth be told for a minute. Time to disrupt for a minute. Not all about money for a minute. But be willing for a minute. We do right by the people for a minute. Time to go hard for a minute. Time to ride for a minute. Time to slide for a minute. Time to know for a minute. Know we are gods for a minute. We in charge for a minute. We've been here for a minute. We've been ready for a minute. Ready to heal for a minute. Ready to build for a minute. To empower for a minute. To go get it for a minute. Let's pull it together for a minute. By sticking together for a minute. Doing it together for a minute. By using our minds for a minute.